welcome to Late Edition. I'm Sakal Bhatt. Tonight on the show, we're going to talk about Theresa May, the UK's Home Secretary, who will be the country's next Prime Minister. Well, this ends 3 weeks of leadership turmoil, so to say, and also some kind of political backbiting that began with Britain's voted last month to exit the European Union. And after the announcement of her name, May promised to build, and I quote, a better Britain and to make the UK's EU exit a success. Mr. Cameron will tender his resignation to the Queen on Wednesday, and her final rival for the Conservative Party leadership, Andrea Leadsom, withdrew from the race on Monday morning, citing overwhelming support for May among Conservative MPs. Let's listen in.
Brexit means Brexit, and we are going to make a success of it. Second, we need to unite our country. And third, we need a strong, new, positive vision for the future of our country. A vision of a country that works not for the privileged few, but that works for every one of us. Because we're going to give people more control over their lives. And that's how, together, we will build a better Britain.
And in the next 24 minutes, we're going to talk about this change of guard in Britain and what does it really mean for the domestic polity and for the world as well. And to do so, we're very honoured to have in the Late Edition studio tonight Ranjan Mithai, former Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us on the show. And extremely glad to have Pramit Paul Chaudhary, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times. Thank you very much, Pramit, for joining us. And sir, let me begin with you. You must have met her a couple of times during your tenure as a High Commissioner there. Now, today, how do you look at this transition? Do you see it as a smooth one for her, considering the initial reactions that we are picking up? She's promised great certainty and stability to Britain, but how uphill is this task going to be for her?
Well, it is going to be an uphill task, as you describe it. The election has been relatively smooth, but the Conservative Party is still a very divided party. And she will need to tackle those divisions in the midst of negotiations over issues which cause those divisions. So she's not going to have an easy time, I think, but she has got the election by a very substantial majority, which gives her an advantage.
Pramit, your initial reactions?
Yeah, I mean, she's actually been able to secure victory a bit faster than people had expected. There had been talk of Cameron staying on as Prime Minister all the way till October. But she has the interesting thing about May is that she actually campaigned to stay in the European Union. She was part of the Remain team, not part of the Brexit supporters. So she will actually have an interesting problem of heading a party or coming to power because of a referendum that she actually opposed. So she will have to heal the divisions within her own party and show, as she has already said, that she will stick to the referendum's verdict and negotiate the EU out. Second, she will face an economic problem. Britain will almost certainly slip into some sort of a recession in the next couple of quarters as a cost of the Brexit vote and the capital flight that is ensuing from Britain. So she, as a Prime Minister, will have to find a response to those economic problems. And then finally, as she said, she will negotiate with the European Union, but the European Union desperately wants to ensure that Britain does not succeed economically or politically after it leaves the European Union, if only to ensure that other European countries are not encouraged to leave the Union. So her negotiations with the European Union, I expect, will be extremely difficult. And they've already said that labour mobility, which in effect is open immigration, which was the primary issue of the referendum, Britain wants trade access, market access to the European Union. It has to ensure labour mobility, which then makes the referendum completely pointless if Britain were to concede that.
Okay. Considering the political consequences, do you see any sort of snap election or the elections for that matter, the kind of voices that are coming in from other parties? There's a lot of criticism for that matter that, quoting one of the Labour Party's MP, he said that, you know, she's never won an election for her party, leave alone for the country. So actually questioning her democratic credentials, or for that matter, sir, her elevation to the topmost post from Home Secretary to PM.
Well, it can't be ruled out. In fact, there is a belief that to be able to negotiate successfully, the Prime Minister would need to have another election, win it, and then go to negotiations. But I don't know if that is inevitable. You know, it is a fact that while Theresa May did oppose I mean, she voted, she was on the Remain camp, she was not a prominent campaigner. And she kept a kind of a distance from the actual campaign, as if she were keeping her options open. The fact is now the majority of the MPs back her. The party rank and file, by and large, I think will also support her. So she has a fairly strong hand to be able to go in and deal with the negotiations. But as I said in the beginning, and as Pramit has just said, these negotiations take place against a backdrop of very conflicting demands, sometimes contradictory goals, and therefore they are not going to be easy. And she is going to face huge challenges. What that means for the party, we will know in a couple of months. There's going the usual time for the party conference is end of September or beginning of October. The party conference will reveal just how much she has the full backing, whether she needs actually to go in for an election or whether she can just go ahead as planned now.
Pratim, she must unite a party. That's one challenge, as you just mentioned earlier. She has to unite the country post-Brexit. The fact that she voted for Remain, and now having said that, the Brexiters will be watching her every move very clearly so that there's no black sliding. Now how is she going to really come up to that terms?
She'll also have to watch out for the UKIP, the UK Independent Party, which was the party whose basically anti-EU position was one of the reasons that the rise of that party was one of the reasons Cameron felt it necessary to hold a referendum. So while the UKIP presently is leaderless, it's very clear that they've said that we will hold the present government to the referendum, and they of course take an extremely hard line on what the new relationship with the EU is. And then, as you said, the Conservative Party itself, whether it's Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, or even Andrea Leadsom, who just was the last challenger, all of them will be positioning themselves to watch every step she makes and argue that she has betrayed or not betrayed the party's position should we say, the verdict of the referendum with her positions. So in negotiations where she will have to be extraordinarily tough with the EU and will face a very difficult position because, as I said, the EU's response will be equally difficult. And for the EU, you have to realize for them the number one concern is the French presidential elections next year.
Okay.
Because already they have 2 rounds of votes in France, and Marine Le Pen, who is the head of the National Front, who supports, is essentially the same as Boris Johnson, she wants France to leave the EU, is at present one of the strongest candidates for that election. And they have to ensure that Britain suffers so that she is discredited or does not win support in France, because without France the EU is effectively finished.
So how do you look at the point?
I mean, I think the point is well taken. Yet it is a fact that the British economy is the 5th largest in the world. It's a very, very important market for many European countries. So I think they will temper their anger and their desire to make a kind of deterrent example of Britain with a dose of reality. So I think the question will be how they negotiate. I think for the British, there are 2 principal points. One is on the question of migration, and as Pramit mentioned, that is something on which it will be very difficult, and I think Theresa May has already said that she would be willing to pay a certain price in terms of market access, but on that she would not back down, and that is how she has actually carved out a place for herself, tough position on immigration. The second is the sense of taking back control, in a sense, of policies and decisions. She had an experience of it herself when people who were convicted for terrorist offences and crimes, the European Court of Human Rights overruled her, and that created a sense in Britain that we better have a little more control over our own destiny, as it were. I think those 2 are the areas on which she will take a strong line. On the trade and economic negotiations, there will be a great deal of give and take, but it will be very difficult for the European Union to allow Britain anything. I mean, the closest example given today is that of Norway, But Norway does allow, while it's outside the Union, it has market access and has access to the single market, but it does allow free movement of people.
Yeah.
So how will they manage the British exceptionalism is going to be very interesting to watch. And I think the key will be the German leadership. The Germans will be the one, Angela Merkel in particular, who will, I think, have to play the biggest role in finding a way out of this which matches the requirements of both sides.
So the real elephant in the room, would we say, would be immigration, and especially what is she really going to do with the 3 million EU nationals, as pointed out?
Well, yes, immigration, as has been mentioned, was the #1 issue in the referendum. More than anything else, that was the reason that galvanized the anti-EU vote in the election. And while the Conservative Party has said that they will not throw out EU nationals who live in England, obviously if you're going to Britain anyway is not part of the Schengen system, but if you are going to renegotiate the issue of labour mobility, then the legal status of these EU nationals will have to change. They will have to become residents or of some variety, but they will no longer be allowed to just cross into England without a visa, for example, or some form of change will have to be made. And negotiating that nature of that status is what the EU will fight. EU will insist that they must maintain the right, as if English people cross into France and France in the other direction, that they not be required to have, let's say, a visa or at best show a passport and walk through. And Britain will probably insist that it'll have to be changed. And attached to that, of course, is the right to work. How much right to employment would an EU national have in Britain? It's highly restricted for almost everybody else. And again, the EU will struggle will demand that they have the right to of employment more or less the same as the
Just to quote her position on this, what is she going to do with the EU nationals? She said that she couldn't guarantee, I couldn't guarantee a permanent place, although I would like them to stay. Their status would be subject to the withdrawal negotiations, which later she softened her stand on. So
I mean, the issues, as Pramit has just mentioned, that there are a very significant number of Brits also living in the continent and taking it for granted that they can go in there. In fact, they have acquired properties and houses in France and so on. So they would want to retain some of that. But I think for Theresa May, the overriding priority of being able to deliver something on the immigration will be paramount. And I think that will colour the way she proceeds. But there's another tough one which is going to stare her in the face. And that is, how do these negotiations impact Scotland in particular, and to a lesser extent Northern Ireland? Because if they are not managed in a way in which the Scots feel that they are able to retain some of the advantages of being European, then the Scots may ask for another referendum themselves. And that is not something I think she'd want to have on her hands immediately.
At least at this point in time. As a Home Secretary, the media there was just going through some of the websites, and they're mentioning that she failed to meet the government's targets as far as containing the immigration numbers are concerned as a Home Secretary. Now, so much of criticism because, of course, there is a good amount of opposition to her elevation, but now when actually she's got this huge post-Brexit consequence to deal with.
On immigration, I mean, the point is that she basically tried to, the problem that the Cameron government faced on immigration was that while they savagely restricted immigration from every non-EU countries, including India, for example, the number of Indians who could become British citizens every year kept shrinking, the Commonwealth was virtually cut out. She couldn't do anything about the European Union because under treaty obligation he had to let them come in and do as and when they felt like it. So her policy will now be to try, as Prime Minister and as Britain leaves the EU, to restrict that EU number as well. The problem that will, to some degree, it will automatically solve itself or correct itself because as the British economy slows down, the amount of demand for labour will slacken off. But ultimately, given you look at Britain geographically, you look at the fact that it is dependent on food imports, it is dependent on huge amounts of capital because it runs a large current account deficit. It cannot really stay away from a large amounts of immigration to sustain it, and it's an aging population. So how much immigration they can actually restrict is questionable. no matter what type of agreement they strike with the European Union. And as has been mentioned, millions of Britons live overseas, and if they are forced and in a reciprocity situation, they will be forced to come back. Immigration is one of those policies that it is very difficult for a nation like Britain, given where it is and where its economy, how the nature of its economy, which is largely services, is based, that it can't really restrict it beyond a certain point. So I think they will see a fall in immigration, largely because their economy will slow down. But I don't see the broad numbers dropping beyond maybe a few 100,000.
You
perhaps.
don't see a drastic change?
I don't really see a drastic change.
So,
no, I think we won't see a drastic change, but I mean, just to put matters in perspective,
sure.
between 2003, 2004 and the current situation, the number of people declaring themselves, I mean, who are known to be foreign born, increased from around 3.5 million to just under 9 million today. So that's a dramatic increase. So I think they will have to introduce some tougher rules to demonstrate that immigration can be slowed down. The economic slowdown will have its own effect, but I think in the negotiations, if they are able to achieve some degree of rules while retaining some association with Europe, I think they would that would go a very long way in satisfying the average person in the country. But it is going to be very difficult because there are large sectors of the economy which have become dependent on immigration. In a sense, immigration has fed the success of the economy because it has created greater purchasing power also. So this will have to be balanced out. But I think in the short run, they may be willing to pay a certain price, but show that they can control immigrant flows.
What about the spending? There's a lot of talk about how she's going to contain that in defense sector, particularly the nuclear plant projects that are underway. The overall spending pattern now for her to deal with.
Well, anyway, the Cameron government had come in on a very tight austerity program platform. The previous Labour government had clearly overspent. There was a huge fiscal overhang. And so the past 2.5 years, you've seen the Cameron government tighten British expenditure, especially on the social services. There's been a huge cut. Defence has already been slashed. The British Army now is smaller than the Nepalese Army. But I'm not too sure that, and May will face a recession which will further curb revenue. But my sense is that she will probably try to start to increase spending within the next 1 year, partly because she will need to keep the economy from going into recession, and partly because she'll have to keep in mind the possibility of early elections, in which case normally a political leadership likes to spend money in the run-up to an election because people feel good as a consequence.
You see elections coming?
Difficult to say. My guess would be that if she has, there'll be the Labour Party is undergoing. The good thing for her is that the opposition is in complete disarray. Labour Party leadership is in a fight within itself. But she has a situation where that if the EU negotiations go badly, in other words, her own party is divided as to the degree with which she has extracted concessions from the EU, she may feel it necessary, and if it combines with an economic slowdown, she may feel it necessary to go back to the polls at some point to essentially legitimize the consequences of the negotiations. Because her problem will be that between UKIP, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, there's an entire spectrum of position on the anti-EU or European skepticism within her party and the British conservative right. And I don't think she will be able to extract the kind of concessions from the EU that will get all of these groups happy.
On board, yeah.
In which case, elections may be necessary to bring her on board. And if the opposition and the Liberal Democrats and the Labour are both very pro-EU, so if they come in and say, we're not going to support you, we think you've conceded too little, or the EU, you should be trying to get closer to the EU, then she'll be caught between two stools, and then an election may be her only solution.
And also those who are opposing her, also going back to 2007 when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair unopposed, and she was very, she was very vocal about the fact that why there were no elections at that point in time, and all that is being really raked up now. Do you think that's really really justified in a way? Will it really make any difference for her to stay where she is now, considering she's got a lot of challenges to deal with, but this internal party bickering, internal and intra, both?
Yeah, I think she will need to get a grip on these negotiations, and then I think weigh up the benefits and the pitfalls of seeking electoral mandate again. Because if it looks like it's going to be very, very difficult, very tricky, then one way out may be to go for an election, get independent confirmation that you are the leader from the entire nation, and then go back to the Europeans. But that said, to revert to what you were saying earlier, she is a more traditional conservative, as we know it, in a sense, than David Cameron is.
Okay.
She's older, 10 years older than he is. In fact, he's going to be looking for a job, I think. 10 years older than he is, and she has generally followed the party line on all major issues. So she's fiscally, she's not adventurous, she's a conservative.
She enjoys a reputation of being a tough taskmaster.
She is very much the bureaucrats in
Your
the
association
home,
with her, if you could just share some snippets.
the bureaucrats in the Home Office definitely felt
Yeah, a crisis
the
manager,
pressure,
that's how
yeah.
they put it.
But I mean, just one issue since you mentioned on defense spending. She is one of those who voted in Parliament for the replacement of the Trident. Now, that's going to be a very, very big budgetary issue. But it's also a symbol of her understanding of Britain's role in the world, that they are not retreating to a kind of Little England kind of posture.
Okay.
They still see themselves as a global power, and I think she will follow that line. So she will need to spend the money, first to keep, as Pramit has said, that voter support for the Conservative Party, make sure that the recession doesn't bite, and also preserve Britain as a viable, progressive entity. So I think we are going to see a very interesting person emerge. She has, as you mentioned, a reputation of being very tough. One has seen that.
Okay.
We have dealt with her on issues relating to visas and so on, and she takes very strong positions.
Okay.
But at the same time, she is not somebody who follows the conservative positions, say, of Mrs. Thatcher entirely. She calls herself a one-nation conservative, a one-nation Tory, which is the appeal of the party has to be bigger than to a single class or to a single group. It has to be able to appeal to all. So, for example, she came out with something which for a conservative is a very strange suggestion, saying that, for example, the companies, when they deal with executive pay, there's been a great complaint that there's been growing inequality because of the way pay scales are increasing. She has said that if shareholders give a view on it, then it should be binding on the company. Yes. The second, that workers should be represented on the boards in greater numbers. So she is appealing to a very traditional, old-fashioned kind of conservatism, which reflects, I think, her own upbringing and her own beliefs.
Final word from both of you. Now, for Britain, dealing with the Brexit consequences is one thing, but a new Prime Minister, a woman Prime Minister takes over. It's also about, like you just mentioned, world should not look at Britain as a small England, but she has to walk the tightrope as well. Overall, what does this really mean for the country as in terms of really enjoying the confidence of her people? I'm talking about the Brits and the relationship now that she will forge with India, considering the successful trip our Prime Minister had and the association he has had with Cameron. First from you.
Well, the British Trade Secretary has already, I think, come to India and has indicated, as we would expect, that if Britain's trade relations with the EU are going to at least be uncertain and volatile, Britain needs to compensate in other areas, and a separate, and remember now Britain has been tied to the EU's trade policy now for what, 20 plus years. So Britain now has to negotiate separate trade agreements with all of these trading partners it had. So India is one of the countries, just because we happen to be an emerging economy that is still growing, will be one of the economies that the UK will be obviously looking at. And we've traditionally had and he'll also be looking at Indian investment. If I'm correct, we are the third largest FDI source in the UK. And companies like Tata, for example, are an enormous presence in Britain. So they want to keep that investment flowing into to Britain. So therefore, India will be a key country that they will be negotiating with. I know there have been stories that they Indians expect immigration concessions. I doubt that. The Commonwealth quota began shrinking in the 1970s, well before Britain embedded itself in the EU system. Anti-immigration sentiment is across the board. It is not just the European Union. So I don't expect very much there. But on the trade and the investment side, I see if India can, in theory at least, leverage a lot more out of Britain because of Britain's present economic plight.
Right. So
I would agree, because the propensity of Indian private sector to invest in Britain is much higher than the rest of Europe. In fact, our investments in Britain are higher than the total investments in the rest of the EU. Britain, there is a political consensus, whichever party you talk to, that relations with India have to be built up. So I think that's secure. In fact,
that's going to be on a positive trajectory.
That will be a positive trajectory. They would like to negotiate a stronger trade and economic relationship with us. I agree there won't be any concessions on immigration. But I think the political relations also, they would like to have a sense that the fact that they are not in the EU has not meant that they are not an influential country, that they do not have important partners even outside the trade framework. I think a lot will depend also on the United States election and its outcome, what kind of attitude the next president takes to keeping that special relationship with Britain, which is talked about. So it would be an interesting time. But I don't think things, what you mentioned about the new leader representing the whole nation, the negotiations are going to be very, very difficult.
Very tough.
And the Conservative Party throughout its history has been famous for being very ruthless, and decisions to change their leader can come out of the blue. So I think she has to
and
watch.
also to get the confidence of her own people
She has to
as
watch
the
her
Prime
flanks.
Minister of Britain. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. And I also thank Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times, and former Foreign Secretary Ranjan Mathai for joining us on Late Edition. With that, we quickly wrap up the show. But meanwhile, news and updates continue on your channel, national channel DD News. Stay tuned. Namaskar.